Welcome again to the Henry George School. This is just a continuation of the series that we are offering together with Dan's organization, Saving Communities. We have two more coming after this one. The next one, if I'm not wrong, should be George on the Chinese question. And the third one, the last one, would be applying the law of rent to the other two factors of production. So he calls it marginal land, marginal labor, and marginal capital. So tonight we'll be talking about monopolies, media monopolies especially, and their huge influence in shaping social thought. Dan, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to share something from Prager University, who I quite often have a high regard for. They're basically a conservative, a semi-right-wing perspective, and they're very good in showing what's wrong with the left, but they're very bad at defending they basically defend what's wrong with the right. And this is one of the cases where they're defending what's wrong with the right. And so I'd like to start with this because they're basically making something sound very good and very simplistic when it's actually much more complicated and much more nefarious than they portray it. So this is them praising private enterprise over government, and there's three examples, and the other two examples are probably legitimate, but this one was the telegraph. And so I'd like to play it, and I'll interrupt it and each time they make a point and discuss why that point is invalid. So here we go.
The telegraph was the first step toward the instant communication we have today. Invented by Samuel Morse, the telegraph transmitted sound as dots and dashes representing letters of the alphabet. Morse, more of an idealist than a businessman, agreed to let the government own and operate the telegraph in the national interest. But the government steadily lost money each month it operated the telegraph. During 1845, expenditures for the telegraph exceeded revenue by 6 to 1 and sometimes by 10 to 1. Seeing no value in the invention, Congress turned the money loser over to private enterprise. In the hands of entrepreneurs, the business took off. Telegraph promoters showed the press how it could instantly report stories occurring hundreds of miles away.
Okay, before I get into the instantly create stories, the first thing is that they didn't turn it over to Western Union until, so they started operating the telegraph in 1845. They didn't turn it over to Western Union until 1862, when they were in the middle of a civil war, and they were strapped for cash to fight the war, and yet they were subsidizing the telegraph, which I'll get into. But the point he's making here is that it allowed people, the Western Union created a wire service that allowed newspapers to carry news, and they gloss over the fact that Western Union created the Associated Press monopoly and didn't allow anybody to get news that wasn't part of that Associated Press monopoly. And the quid pro quo was that you could not criticize the railroads or Western Union. If you did, you were kicked out of the Associated Press. So, and this is playing at high speed. That's why he's talking quickly, but it's just as well.
Bankers, stockbrokers, and insurance companies saw how they could instantly monitor investments near and far.
Okay, and so stockbrokers could instantly manage investments from near and far. What he doesn't tell you is that Western Union gave insider information to the stockbrokers and investors it was tight with. So whenever legislation was passed that would affect people outside of Washington, D.C., which is almost always, Western Union's cronies found out about it before anybody else did. And that created some interesting scandals in itself.
Quality of service improved. Telegraph lines were strung across the country, from 40 miles of wire in 1846 to 23,000 miles in 1852. By the 1860s, the U.S. had a transcontinental telegraph wire. And by the end of that decade, entrepreneurs had strung a telegraph cable across the Atlantic Ocean.
What he doesn't tell you here is that Europe also had telegraph everywhere, and Europe's telegraph was largely government owned and was quite extensive as well. But it is true that it's a brand new technology, which gets to the next point that he's going to try to make.
Why didn't the US government profitably use what Morse had invented?
Well, because their goal was not to make a profit. Their goal was to make US land valuable. Government subsidizes things in order, the increase in land value because of things that government has subsidized, like roads. Roads are free. Government doesn't make a profit on roads, right? The government taxes pay for the roads, and the land becomes extremely valuable because it's accessible to the roads. Land that is not accessible to the road has almost no value at all. Well, cities that are accessible to telegraph systems and telephone systems and the internet today, and to post office services, that land is worth a lot more because of that accessibility. So what he's missing here is what the right misses generally, is that government's function is to increase the value of land, not to increase the value, not to profit from the direct operation of the enterprise in question.
The answer is that the incentives for bureaucrats differ sharply from those of entrepreneurs. When government operated the telegraph, Washington bureaucrats received no profits from the messages they sent. And the cash they lost was the taxpayers, not their own. So
no, the cash they lost was not lost. It made the taxpayers much more prosperous to have access to cheap telegraph. It did not make the taxpayers less prosperous. The taxes they paid to subsidize the telegraph came out of the added value that the telegraph created. This is very much the mirror opposite of what Marxists say, in that when they say, well, the capitalist exploits the workers because he's taking value that the workers created. And it's like, no, he organized the enterprise, and that value would not have existed if he hadn't created it. And in the same token, that land value would not have existed if government did not put up the roads or the telegraphs or the sewer systems or the electric utilities or whatever. So that's, again, this is the right wing. It's good to bash the right wing for their stupidities every once in a while, because I often bash the left wing for theirs. And this is a fine opportunity to do that. I'm going to slow this down a little bit. It's slightly faster than normal.
Government officials had no incentive to improve service, to find new customers, or to expand to more cities.
No, that's not true. They had political incentives driven by the desire of those cities to have access to telegraph, so their land values would go up. They had plenty of incentives. The incentives manifest themselves politically. Economically, however, they do increase the value of land. It's something that they wanted to do. The telegraph, on the other hand, had the incentive to exploit people and to keep the telegraph artificially expensive, which will bring to his next point.
But entrepreneurs like Ezra Cornell, the founder of Western Union, did. Cheaper, better service meant more customers and more profits.
But he kept the price of the service artificially high. And as we will show with Henry George's letter to the Western Union stockholders, Ezra Cornell actually set up monopoly pricing to freeze out independent newspapers, and did so in such a way that they lost revenue. So they lost revenue for Western Union in order to serve the monopoly newspaper, and in order to protect themselves and the railroads from public criticism.
15 years after Congress privatized the telegraph, both the costs of construction and the rates for service linking the major cities were as little as 1/10 of the original rates established by Washington.
Okay, now that sounds like, wow, they made that the private enterprise made it cheaper. It's 1/10 as much, but the computer I'm making this presentation on costs far less than 1/10 of what the computer cost 15 years ago. And the computer is not brand new technology. It's the computer technology is, began in the 40s. So when you look at the cost of construction and rates for service and stuff, this was all advancing at a phenomenal rate. And what he also doesn't talk about is that they got subsidies. They got land grants, and they got $40,000 a year in cash each year to build the transcontinental telegraph. 40,000 doesn't sound like a lot today, but it's more like 4 million in those days, and it's just the string wires. So again, this is him being very simplistic. He's from Hillsdale College, which is also a conservative university or a conservative college. I don't know if they're a university. I'm going to close that because I want to get to the actual slideshow. So let me close this and talk about how they actually did this. The Pacific Railroad and Telegraphy Act of 1862, Western Union got $40,000 a year for subsidies for putting up telegraph within the parameters of the bill. They got free rights of way. They got land grants in addition to cash, and they got the exclusive monopoly. Union Pacific and Central Pacific got much bigger benefits. They got the same exclusive rights of way, so the telegraph ran along the railroad lines. They got a capitalization requirement that they were able to falsify, and the credit mobilier scandal is a whole session in itself. They got 179 million acres of land, and they got exclusive monopolies in that your town was almost always served by one railroad. And even if your town is served by multiple railroads, they don't all go to the other places. So your town might have, if you're in Chicago, you have a railroad to Indianapolis, and you have a railroad to Cleveland or Pittsburgh, and you have a railroad going west. But you don't have two railroads going to the same place, because that would be stupid anyhow. So you get exclusive monopolies. And when Henry George talked about natural monopolies, he was basically talking about two kinds of monopolies. He was talking about coercive monopolies, which is like the military, the courts, tort courts especially. You can have binding arbitration courts that are private because both parties to the contract stipulated that in the contract. But if you want to charge somebody with fraud in creating the contract, that's called ab initio, which means it was fraudulent from the outset. And so that can go to a tort court. And the other is right-of-way monopolies, water, sewer, railroads, streetcar lines, telegraph, telephone, cable TV. Those are all right-of-way monopolies, and it's competition in those things has been tried, and it's had a terrible track record. So so they created this Railroad and Telegraphy Act in 1862, and by 1866 they were regretting it. And this is from February of 1866 in the Congressional, it wasn't called the Congressional Record back then, it was called the Congressional Globe, which might have been a private reporting company that did what the Congressional Record does today. But a Congressman Brown of Missouri said almost the whole of telegraph lines are consolidated into ostensibly two giant concerns: the Western Union, covering the Western lines, and the American Telegraph Company, whoops, I didn't spell that right, covering the Eastern. It is said, however, that the large stockholders own into each to such an extent as to make them virtually one, and that rules despotically, precludes all lateral connections, fixed its own tariff, and according to the authority of Mr. Prescott, will let no one but the Associated Press, another giant monopoly, send any special dispatch or any news to any paper except from Washington and Albany. So government dispatches is basically what he's talking about, and government dispatches went to everybody because they knew that they didn't want to screw with the government. But in general, private news stories that were of great interest nationally, only the Associated Press members could get them. And he goes on and says, these two companies do not traverse each other's ground, as the Associated Press monopolizes both. There is not benefit of competition here, which is the only ground on which the claim for leaving the telegraph to private enterprise is reposed. So he's basically, and this is the difference between the actual progressives and socialists, is the actual progressives wanted to leave everything possible up to private enterprise, but where there was a government privilege involved, where the enterprise could not exist without the exclusive right-of-way, then they were for government doing it. And this is something that would develop with Henry George a long time afterwards. So in 1866, they proposed to start another postal telegraph, and it would have a uniform rate like postage. I'm not sure I agree with that. If it costs more, you know, if the telegraph is capable of having one operator in New York click on the keypad and have it go all the way to California on one wire, then yeah, maybe a uniform rate makes sense. I think they have had relay stations and amplifications, but it's not long after this that they had the transatlantic cable, which was underground, and that did, you know, you had one operator pushing it at one end and another operator receiving the information at the other end. So so maybe the uniform rate like postage is good. The lower prices would drive down the private rates. They were of the impression that they could not nationalize the private telegraph. I'm not sure whether they could or not, but that was their impression. And it would end the press monopoly, and it would end the government cost of private telegrams. The government was paying serious money to this private telegraphy company. And they were, even though the cost went down compared to that first year when the government did it in the 1840s, they were posting extremely high profits, and they had private telegrams and insider market rigging. That's what I was talking about, where you would get inside information that basically gave your insider friends a huge incentive. So there was a great deal of corruption in the government doing something in Washington, D.C., you know, approving, for example, approving the telegraph line that was going to run under the isthmus at San Francisco Bay. There was no Golden Gate Bridge at that time, but it was going to run under the that isthmus, and it would give telegraph service to the north. Is that Humboldt County or Marin County? But it was going to give that county telegraph service. Well, that would greatly increase the land value on the other side of the bay. And so the insiders would find out about it first and go and buy up land there. So that was basically the argument that they had. Well, Western Union, the other thing that they had done is that during the war, when government wasn't going to mess with them, they froze out the independent newspapers entirely. So in San Francisco, for example, 3 newspapers were the only ones that got telegraph service from the East, and they became very prosperous. And the other San Francisco newspapers languished because they could not compete with a newspaper that had national news, especially during the Civil War. Everybody wanted to know about the Civil War. The Civil War did not affect California very much, but they still wanted to know about it because it's their country, it's exciting. And those 3 papers had it. Well, after this, in 1866, this proposal to create a postal telegraph operation got them to start cleaning up their act, and they created a schedule. So the Associated Press members got a discount because they were sending 1 message, and 3, 4, and eventually 5 San Francisco newspapers joined the Associated Press. And those 5 newspapers got, the first one paid what an independent would pay, then the second one got paid less, and the third one paid less still, and the 4th and 5th paid that same rate that the 3rd one, and then they averaged them out. So everybody ended up paying a good bit less than the independent papers paid, but it was not that bad. And so Henry George started working for the San Francisco Herald, which was an independent paper, on the expectation that even though they were at a disadvantage, it would not be an impossible disadvantage. And then what happened was this proposal for the postal telegraph got defeated by 1868. It had just lost, and the government appeared to be giving up on it. So Western Union went back to its monopoly practices, and this time gave the Associated Press, the 5 newspapers of the Associated Press got the same rate to split 5 ways as any independent newspaper would get for a mere copy of the same transmission. So, and not only that, that the transmission itself was slanted in the way that that the Western Union preferred it. So, so Henry George wrote this letter of protest. It's on my website under savingcommunities.org/docs, DOCS, /George.Henry. And if you get down to that, it lists the things he's written that are on there. And one of them is the Western Union Telegraph Company. But he called it, "In resistance to an effort to crush out a single newspaper and to establish upon the Pacific coast a most odious and oppressive monopoly, I appeal as a last resort to an enlightened public opinion, and especially to the American press, upon whose sense of justice I feel that I can confidently rely." So that's his intro, and he specifies the rates they're charging. It's a fairly detailed piece, but he said, "You actually undertake to kill the Herald and to prevent future competition at a loss to yourselves, to do more work for less money for the sake of giving certain favorites a monopoly." What they did was at the same time they lowered the rates for members of the Associated Press, they more than doubled the rates to the independent newspapers. And it was to the point where the independent newspapers were paying about 15 times as much as the Associated Press was paying for the same amount, for the monthly subscription to the same number of words. And he says, when the very lowest and most selfish motive is thus wanting, which is to make more money, when you thus consent to crush enterprise, not merely for no gain to yourself, but at a positive loss to your stockholders, how can your action be accounted for except as prompted by the very lust for monopoly? You may escape legal penalty, but you will be arraigned before the bar of public opinion, not only in California, but in every part of the country where the facts are known. And you will be adjudged guilty without an extenuating circumstance. You may, it is true, give a convincing proof of your power over the press, but surely this is not needed. The newspapers of California, which hardly dare notice the incorporation of a rival company and dare not endorse a public measure of which you disapprove, are subservient enough already. So, and he finishes, permit me to say in recapitulation that if you persist in giving the proposed monopoly to the California Association, you will restrain the liberty of the press and prevent the establishment of new papers as popular sentiment calls for them as effectually as any press law which could be devised. You will say to the largest political party in California that it shall have no organ, that's the Democrats, that it shall have no organ of its views worthy of the name of newspaper. You will deprive of employment a large number of men, cut off from some of them the hope of an honorable and successful career, and all this to your present pecuniary loss, to the positive injury of your stockholders, and at the risk of exciting against your company a strong and bitter sentiment, which will call loudly for such legislation as that which your president at the last session of Congress so earnestly opposed. So, and allow me to take the liberty of reminding you that the telegraph, which has become a necessity of individual and social life, is not merely private property to be used to build up certain individuals or crush others as whim, caprice, or selfish interest may dictate. It is a great public trust to be administered for the benefit of the whole community. Especially is this true of the lines which connect the Atlantic with the Pacific, and of which you have uncontrolled possession. The people's money aided to build the overland line, but this money was not voted that a crushing monopoly might be created, and energies of individuals paralyzed by wealthy combinations. So here's Henry George just pointing out exactly what the guy from Hillsdale College and Prager University was glossing over. The collusion of a communications monopoly to control the media and actually to control politics and control a lot of other things. And if, you know, if government ran a telegraph, they would be in violation of the First Amendment if they did this. But because they subsidized the monopoly, and the monopoly operating as a proxy, because they were a creation of the government, this private monopoly is rigging the news without penalty at that time. And this manifested itself most egregiously in the Hayes-Tilden presidential race. Rutherford B. Hayes on the left was the Republican, Samuel Tilden was the Democrat. And Western Union wanted Rutherford B. Hayes and rigged the news to favor Hayes, and Tilden was winning anyhow. And Tilden got 250,000 more votes than Rutherford B. Hayes got. And so this is the scandal of that era. This is 1876. And the New Yorker had an article on this and said, chief among the plotters for the Western Union was an Ohioan. Rutherford B. Hayes was governor of Ohio for 3 terms. And so he was very popular in Ohio. And this Ohioan named William Henry Smith. Smith ran the Western arm of the Associated Press, and in this way controlled the bulk of the copy that ran in many small town newspapers. The Western AP operated in tight affiliation, some would say collusion, with Western Union, which exercised a near monopoly over the nation's telegraph lines. Early in the campaign, Smith decided that he would employ any means necessary to assure a victory for Hayes, who at the time was serving his 3rd term as Ohio's governor. In the run-up to the Republican National Convention, Smith orchestrated the release of damaging information about the governor's rivals. Then he had the Western AP blare Hayes's campaign statements and mute Tilden's. At one point, an unflattering piece about Hayes appeared in the Chicago Times, a Democratic paper. The AP flooded the wires with articles discrediting the story. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Once the votes had been counted, attention shifted to South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, states where the results were disputed. Both parties dispatched emissaries to the 3 states to try to influence the electoral outcome. Telegrams sent by Tilden's representatives were passed on to Smith, courtesy of Western Union. Smith, in turn, shared the contents of these dispatches with the Hayes forces. This proto-hack of the Democrats' private communications gave the Republicans an obvious edge. Meanwhile, the AP sought and distributed legal opinions supporting Hayes. So here's basically the communications monopolies of the day, doing everything in their power to support Hayes, including letting the Hayes people read the Tilden people's emails. And this was greatly resented, and it led Terence Powderly, who was his title was the Grandmaster Workman. This is because the Knights of Labor grew out of the Masons. The original founder of the Knights of Labor was a Mason, and he made it look like a Masonic society. That didn't do them any good with the Catholic Church, but that's another tangent. But Powderly said that the government shall, this was their declaration of principles, this is their platform basically in 1884, that the government shall obtain possession by purchase under the right of eminent domain of all telegraphs, telephones, and railroads, and that hereafter no charter or license be issued to any corporation for construction or operation of any means of transporting intelligence, passengers, or freight. And that's also on savingcommunities.org/docs. It's under Powderly, under Terence Powderly, and it's called Land Transportation and Telegraphy. And he gets into the land issue and the transportation issue and the telegraph issue, and he disputes Henry George over the free trade issue. His position was, get the land value tax and free trade will take care of itself. And he was very unhappy that Henry George was advocating free trade prior to the land value tax being adopted. And that's another tangent of this, but it's a very good argument that he has against Henry George's emphasis on free trade prior to land value tax. But Powderly in his annual address says, I believe the government of the United States should operate its own lines of telegraph. I believe that it is absolutely necessary for the welfare and prosperity of the country that the government establish a telegraph system to be used in the interest of the people. And he talks about the Hayes-Tilden race. He says, the last presidential election witnessed a scene which no patriot wishes to see again. The fate of the nation hung in the balance. The country was in doubt as to which of the candidates for the presidency had been chosen. It was plainly stated in the metropolis of the United States that one man, whose name I will not mention here, was tampering with the election returns from certain parts of the country with a view to defeating the will of the people. It was not only stated that such was the case, but no one doubted it. It was only when threats of hanging him to a lamppost were made that the announcement went forth that the returns would be given to the people accurately as they came in. So this scandal created real resentment of Western Union and renewed interest in nationalizing the telegraph. And the president of the telegraph line, Norvin Green, he said he threw up a "what about the other guy" thing. He said, it may be worthy of suggestion, however, that if the government must go into this kind of business, there are many articles of far more general use and consumption, which, if taken hold of and furnished at a cheap and uniform rate to the masses, would afford vastly more general relief to the public. Coal, a product of the earth, and unmined a part of the eminent domain, is essential to the preservation of life and an absolute necessity to 20 times as many people as ever need to use the telegraph. And Terence Powderly's reply to that was that Western Union had an absolute monopoly. Coal, if you tax the mineral value of coal, the monopoly of coal would be broken up in that way. That the coal monopolists would let go of the land that they didn't have, and anybody could mine coal. And of course, coal would get cheaper and be mined faster. Those today, I mean, this was not an issue in the 1880s. They never dreamed that we would be causing global pollution or creating a situation where we would run out of coal for future generations. But even back then, they also advocated royalties on the coal. So if we charged royalties on the coal and we charged a land value tax on the mineral rights to the coal, making the royalties higher would make the land value lower, and you could regulate how fast the coal is mined that way. But there was no need for government to mine coal. It was not an absolute right-of-way monopoly. And what happens to monopolies, this is what the game monopoly is based on, is that eventually one person owns the whole thing. So Western Union bought out all the independent monopolies and kept merging and merging. And then Jay Gould, the railroad magnate, who engineered a lot of railroad mergers, and put down the telegraphers' strike and he was like having victory after victory. He began to become very powerful, and he took over Western Union. So, and that was a hostile takeover. So Norvin Green and Ezra Cornell eventually got pushed out. They got paid well, but they got pushed out by Jay Gould. And this cartoon is recognizing that. That's Jay Gould looking at his monopolies. And there's a website called Cyber Telegraph or Telecom, cybertelecom.com. I'll look it up later. But in that thing, they said the war between Jay Gould and Western Union was over. Jay Gould won. The war between Western Union and the Baltimore and Ohio Telegraph was over. Jay Gould won. The Atlantic Cable Cartel was bolstered with Jay Gould's Atlantic Telegraph and Cable Company joining the cartel. The telegraphers' strike of 1883 was over. Jay Gould won. The collusion between Western Union and the Associated Press continued. Newspapers chafed at the fees they had to pay Western Union for wire service. So that looked like Western Union had everything. And this is a Puck cartoon. What Jay Gould was so unpopular, and this was a New York City newspaper, they were a little less dependent on cable because much of what happened in New York City. And they weren't messing with dispatches from Washington, so they were able to get government news anyhow. But this is Puck, and in the top corner it says Assembly of Knights of Labor, Richmond, Virginia. The little guy is Terrence Powderly, and the cane with which he's about to whack Jay Gould on the butt says Powderly's speech. And Henry George, you see, is looking on, and it says, "We are Knights of Labor because we believe that the thief who steals $1 is no worse than the thief who steals a railroad, that the burglar who breaks open a house or a vault is no worse than the criminal who destroys or orders the destruction of the property of a railroad or telegraph company. And we believe that the same law should reach out with a firm, unshaken hand and punish both criminals according to the magnitude of their guilt." That was Powderly's address. It's basically Jay Gould is looking at his monopolies. It's a trophy case of his victories. So this is the one example I found of Puck magazine being positive to Henry George. But when Henry George ran for mayor, all the media turned against him because Henry George was the enemy of the press monopoly and the enemy of the railroads and the enemy of Western Union. And the press monopoly itself was afraid to cross Western Union. So the next election we have is Henry George versus Abram S. Hewitt. And Abram S. Hewitt is the Democratic Party candidate put forward by Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall for decades had been putting forward nothing but corrupt insider party hacks, and their elections were very corrupt and they always won. And in this case, they thought that they might lose, so they nominated Abram Hewitt, who is he was the president of Columbia University, he had great prestige, and Henry George, and the Republican was Theodore Roosevelt, who I didn't picture here. He came in third. One of the reasons Roosevelt didn't get as many votes as he would otherwise, it's possible if Henry George had not run, that Roosevelt would have beaten the Democratic nominee. For one thing, they wouldn't have nominated Hewitt. And for another, a lot of Republicans voted for Hewitt because they were afraid of Henry George. So Henry George had attacked the bureaucracy and had attacked the corporate monopolies that dominated the Republican Party. And Abram Hewitt, in his acceptance speech, said, "The injurious effects arising from the conclusion that any considerable portion of our people desire to substitute the ideas of anarchists, nihilists, communists, socialists, and mere theorists," there was no pause in the original, so I put the pause in there because it said mere theorists for the democratic principle of individual liberty, which is what Henry George was. He was the theorist for the democratic principle of individual liberty. But he's saying mere theorist and substitute for that for the democratic principle of individual liberty, which involves the right to private property, would react to the greatest severity upon those who depend upon their daily labor for their daily bread and who are looking forward to a better condition for themselves and their children by the accumulation of capital through abstinence and economy. And of course, Henry George meant to untax capital. Albert J. Nock would later say that Henry George was the best friend the capitalist ever had. But Hewitt goes on, if the dreams of these theorists could be realized, the chief sufferers would be the workmen whose condition they proposed and undoubtedly hope to improve. The ideas they promoted are not new. They have been reduced to practice for a short time at long intervals in the history of the world. The horrors of the French Revolution and the atrocities of the Commune offer conclusive proof of the dreadful consequences of the doctrines which can only be enforced by revolution and bloodshed, even when reduced to practice by men of good intentions and blameless private life. So he's basically running his campaign based on the idea that Henry George is in league with anarchists and socialists and communists. And the news media basically went along with that. So Harper's Weekly echoed that. Here's Henry George, and he's pointing up to the sky, to the clouds, which he has his head in the clouds and he does not have his feet on the ground. And it says theory, and he's tied through a sash that says votes to an anarchist who's picking up a bomb that says practice. Now, I should mention that 1886 is not just the year that Henry George ran for mayor, it was the year of the Haymarket bombing. And Henry George was totally, again, not as vociferously as Terence Powderly was. He was very much against the anarchists of Haymarket. And all my left-wing friends say the anarchists were framed, but the transcripts are online, and even the things that are stricken from the record are online, and they say stricken from the record, but there they are in the record with the word stricken from the record. And it's pretty clear to me that they were guilty. Now, you could make some tenuous arguments, but the idea that they were just plain innocent is absurd. And so they quote Henry George out of context. They say, with all its drawbacks and horrors and shortcomings, the great epic of the French Revolution, now but a century gone, is about to repeat itself here. And what he was saying is that we must prevent that kind of thing from happening. It was not an endorsement of that. It was a repudiation of that, because, you know, when you get to Henry George, he had nothing good to say about anarchist violence. He had some good things to say about bringing government down to a minimum, which is kind of anarchy, and he endorsed anarchism in Tsarist Russia because they did not have the ballot, but he was totally opposed to it here. But this was them smearing Henry George, as they were quick to do. Everything about Abram Hewitt was positive. Everything about Henry George was negative. This cartoon is called A Tough Job for the Atlas of the Labor World. I kind of like it. It's a clever cartoon. This is from Puck, the same people who had, I don't know, no, this is Dalrymple, and the other one was Kepler. Kepler drew the cartoon of Powderly giving Jay Gould a whack. But now that Henry George is running for office, they just ridicule him. So Henry George is saying, if you fellows up there don't keep quiet, I shall have to drop the whole thing. And it's basically people fighting over it. When you get into the details, at the top it says Progressive Labor Party, Free Labor Party, Anarchist Labor Party, the Union Labor Party, Knights of Labor Party, Independent Labor Party. And they're all supposed to be part of the United Labor Party campaign. Although the United Labor Party and the Knights of Labor kicked out the anarchists and the socialists. And then you see down in the lower left, you see Father McGlynn punching Archbishop Corrigan in the face. So, so this was just kind of having a good laugh at Henry George's expense, and I kind of like it, but that was one of those many Puck cartoons against Henry George. This one is it's called Henry George's Horn of Promises, and his sash says Millennium Henry, and out of that horn of promises comes free cigars, no boss, no rent, free shave, free rides, free beer, no work, no police, free land, no taxes, free theater, free boycotts, no nothing. Just so, which is stupid because the know nothings were nothing like him. But this is his horn of promises, and who is this being presented to the worker by? Is the devil, and it says the Mephistopheles of today, honest labor's temptation. And the feather of the cap of the devil's cap, it says anarchy, and on the quill it says journalistic agitation, and down below there's a piece of paper that says pledge to anarchy, soul and body. So you know, Henry George was very much the opposite of an anarchist, but this was what kind of what they were doing. And finally, when Henry George left off or lost the race, this is how they celebrated it. He's climbing up the ladder to, I guess, elope with the voters, and the voters, there's a plank that says vote of the majority, pushing him and his ladder off the window, and he's hanging on to two balloons that say theories, and he's climbing, he's on the bottom rung of a ladder, and the rung he's standing on says mayor, and the next rung says governorship, and the next rung says presidency. So they're saying he was trying to work his way up to be the president. And on the planks on the ground, it says boycott, crank theories, and socialism. And the people going counterclockwise from left is crank, REV, which is probably Reverend McGlynn, anarchist, Irving Hall. I don't know what or who Irving Hall is. Blaineism. Blaine wanted the secret ballot, communist and socialist. So that was basically how the press treated Henry George's campaign, and I think it was mostly because they wanted to defeat the guy who threatened the railroad monopoly, or they were intimidated into doing it. So so there we are. And so with that, I throw it open to questions.
Well, it looks like Marty has a question.
Thank you, Ibrahim, and thanks, Dan. I thought we might be getting all the way up to Facebook, but I guess that's a little bit too much to do. So I want to go back to the Hayes and Tilden race, because I think it should be pointed out that this was the monumental point in history where the federal troops left the South during the Reconstruction as the compromise for the Tilden. So it's kind of interesting that it was the Tilden crowd that arranged for the as the payback for giving up their claim to the presidency. So I don't know, the victims, let's say, were hardly to be celebrated, I suppose.
Yeah, what happened was it was going to go to the House of Representatives, and the Democrats had a slight majority in the House of Representatives. And there was all sorts of disputes that required adjudication. they ended up appointing a commission, and the commission was five members of the Democratic Party, 5 members of the Republican Party, Congress members, and 5 Supreme Court justices. And because Lincoln had packed the Supreme Court justices were 3-2 Republican, and they all voted on party lines. So there was no independence there. And they basically voted to give it to Tilden. And as a gesture, they voted to give it to Hayes, rather. And Hayes had campaigned on ending Reconstruction. So they said, look, give it to Hayes, and we will pull the federal troops out of the South anyhow, and we will end Reconstruction. And that brings up a whole other, maybe we should have a session on the whole antagonism between North and South, which Reconstruction made much, much worse. And so when the federal troops pulled out, a lot of the Jim Crow legislation and anti-Black activities were largely a backlash against several things that ended with Reconstruction, and began with a change in the tenor of abolition, because the abolitionists, up until William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionists were not anti-Southern. There were many abolitionists who said this is a national problem and the national government must bear the cost of ending slavery, which meant the national government would buy the slaves and set them free or something. There's a lot of that. And the Beechers, Harriet Beecher Stowe, probably did more to turn the public against slavery than anybody else. Her Uncle Tom's Cabin was the best-selling book of the century, so it outsold Progress and Poverty, which was only the best-selling book of the 1880s and 1890s. But but the Beechers were very critical of the Garrisonian abolitionists, and Catherine Esther Beecher said that we would end slavery a lot sooner without them. So there's an issue of how that strident vilifying of the South, coupling that with abolition, polarized the situation unnecessarily and maybe caused the Civil War. But the whole thing, Henry George said that the era of great corporate fortunes began with the Civil War. And, war is the health of the state. Well, it's also the health of big corporations, because when everybody's distracted by the war, you can get Congress to sign off on everything. And when the South was temporarily not part of the Union, the Republican Party, which was dominated, there were more Whigs in the Republican Party than there were Republicans. If you look at all the minor parties that merged with the Republican Party, they were still outnumbered by the Whigs. And the Whigs was the party of the bankers and the railroads and the big business people, and they were very much unchecked. So yeah, the end of Reconstruction was a good thing, but the backlash against Reconstruction indicates that maybe there could have been a better way to do it, and I don't know what that is.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, you're welcome. Jeffrey, or Joffrey, you're muted.
First of all, Dan, thank you very much. That was really I'd say the best presentation on the history of the United States in George's time. And I can only say that we haven't learned the lessons of history, because everything you've told us is history repeating itself under different media. Now, my question deals with what happened after, and I'm talking about the progressive era, which was aimed at dismantling the monopolies through antitrust, and an interesting case of cooperatives. When I read Progress and Poverty, I saw that Henry George was frowning at cooperatives because he was saying that, well, cooperatives generated rent. And I said, so what's wrong with that? And one of the Georges here in Australia has also a dislike of cooperatives because of, he says that you are forced to do good. And I said, no, you're not forced to do good. There's principle number one of cooperatives, which is openness and voluntarism. If you don't join the cooperatives, it's fine. Now, the reason why I raise this is I dare say that the United States has the best models for utilities, particularly electric rural cooperatives and telecommunications co-ops. In fact, they are at the cutting edge of technologies. It's not the corporations or governments. And the reason I would say,
are you talking about were you saying in the United States or in Australia?
Yes, the United States.
Okay.
Because I did work there. I was there was a Philippine representative of the National Telephone Cooperatives Association in 1997, 1998. And we were trying to do the same thing in the Philippines, except we encountered the same problems you've mentioned, that the policies were aimed at promoting and protecting monopolies before it would even serve the people. And that was my big frustration back then. And that's what I want. I was wondering, because it was the father of Al Gore who introduced those ideas of electric co-ops and telecommunication co-ops, and even the interstate highways. I was thinking, was Al Gore's dad by any chance a part of the Georgist movement? And did he somehow correct the perspective of George being anti-co-op? And I think he was anti-co-op because the Robert Owen co-op, workers co-ops back then were failing because it transformed the wage earners into rent seekers, and which eventually led to the bankruptcy of Robert Owen's worker co-ops. So that's what I wanted to put that on the table for a discussion and a little think through.
Yeah, Henry George was also against land trusts, and I disagree with him on that. But he said you can't have an island of justice within a sea of injustice. So, but I think that was faulty thinking, because if you have an island of justice, it becomes a beacon to others. I would start with what happened. I will come back to co-ops after we talk about what happened with these monopolies and the antitrust laws. And I think the antitrust laws themselves were ineffective in terms of breaking up trust. Rockefeller, the Standard Oil Company, was one big trust that had absorbed a bunch of different oil companies, and they arbitrarily broke it up. But the Rockefeller family was there was, instead of one humongous company, there was 32 really big companies, and the Rockefeller family had controlling interest in all 32 of them. So you haven't really broken it up. You just have the illusion of competition. Yeah. But what worked a little better was the Interstate Commerce Commission, the legislation that created that, and the common carrier laws. And it basically ruled that telephone and telegraph is a common carrier, and they have to charge the same rates to everybody. And they have to provide, the telegraph was required to send messages on a first come, first served basis. So when you get a message, you can't set it aside and do another message first. The only exception to that was government messages. The government retained the prerogative of saying our government messages can go out first, but all private messages have to be sent in the order received. And so there were various things that tried to make it better, and everybody had to be charged the same rate. If you had a schedule that charged more for a longer distance, you still had to charge everybody. You know, if you're sending something from New York to San Francisco, all San Franciscans at least get the same rate. So there were things like that. But what really ended the telegraph monopoly was Marconi's telegraph radio. And as soon as that invention went out, everybody could bypass the telegraph, the hardwire telegraph. And Western Union rapidly lost market share to them. There were rival companies. There was a John McKay, who was called the Bonanza King. He had one of the biggest silver mines in Colorado, and he had to send a lot of telegraphs, and he hated it. So he started a rival telegraph company and ran his own transatlantic cable, and he competed with Western Union, and he drove down their rates. And Jay Gould said, I cannot, there's nothing I can do about John McKay, because every time he loses money on the telegraph, he just goes to his silver mine and digs up another $1.5 million. And so, but even so, McKay could only compete on transatlantic and certain lines and certain stops, and Western Union still had a monopoly everywhere else. So that wasn't really going to put an end to it. But Marconi's radio did. Marconi's radio ended that monopoly more than any government legislation. You know, when the postal monopoly, the government creating its own postal telegraph died, it just kept getting, I don't know if it ever got voted down. It just kept getting recommitted. And you could see from the discussions that the people who were for it wanted it voted on, and the people who were against it would come up with a reason why we had to table it for now, and they just kept tabling it. But then they started coming up with giving grants to create rival telegraph companies. And these grants included, you know, we're going to give them, they were going to give them 160 acres every so many miles, which was just dangling another prop, and they reduced it to 40 acres, and then they reduced it to 30 acres. One guy said, why have it at all? All you need is a little telegraph office or somebody with a cabin who can ride the wires once in a while. But what happened was they did that, and they subsidized a bunch of other telegraph companies who ran lines, sometimes to places where Western Union didn't exist, and then Western Union just bought them. And it was worth buying because the subsidies they had given to these other companies was a prize for Western Union that that was greater than anything Western Union had. It
was cheaper to buy them than
it was cheaper to buy them. So you're subsidizing competition, and Western Union buys it. And Tom Johnson made this point. Tom Johnson was Henry George's biggest supporter, and he made his fortune on streetcar monopolies. And then he campaigned to get rid of streetcar monopolies and to say that government should just take over the streetcar monopolies. And he had a state-of-the-art streetcar monopoly in Detroit, and he bought this old rundown horse-drawn streetcar monopoly and electrified it and modernized it. And he didn't have all the streetcars in New York, but his was the best. And they were going to require a 3-cent fare from all the other, they were going to require a 3-cent fare from him. And he said, yeah, I'll do that. And he said, and they were going to require a 3-cent fare from his competitors and require them to upgrade. And he said, no, you don't have to, you can regulate me. You don't have to regulate my competitors. And they were surprised by this. And Mayor Pingree of Detroit said, why? I'm amazed that you don't want this burden on your competitor. And Tom Johnson said, when I have modernized the streetcar line, nobody's going to want to patronize this competitor. And his line is going to be such an embarrassment that it's going to go under, and I'm going to buy it. And if I buy it, then any burdens you place on him become burdens you place on me. And Mayor Pingree said, well, suppose we put a stipulation in there that says you can't buy it. And he said, I will have a friend buy it. And we'll just call him Smith for now. But when Smith buys it, then Smith and I are going to be very close, and there's nothing you can do about that.
Or he can lend him money to buy it for him, right?
Right. I can lend him the money, and then he's beholden to me, and I can own it. So what the mayor said is there any way we can stop you from owning this? And he said, yeah, the city can buy it. If the city buys it, then there's nothing I can do about that. And if the city buys it and lowers the rates, there's nothing I can do about that either.
Yeah.
So what Tom Johnson was advocating is actually what the antitrust people in 1866 were advocating with telegraph, which is the only way to stop it is for the government to own it. And
now we know of another option now, which is cooperativize it.
Oh yes, and that's the other was cooperatives. Henry George has 2 chapters in Science and Political Economy called Cooperatives, It's Two Ways, and Cooperatives, It's Cooperation, It's Two Kinds. And what Henry George's point was, if you abolish privilege, then everything becomes cooperative. That we don't have to have a cooperative structure that is directed cooperation, that all interactions end up being cooperative. And if you don't abolish privilege, then the cooperatives become collective monopolists. So you know, the Land O'Lakes butter is operated by a farming cooperative, but they have a monopoly. If they won't let you in the cooperative if you don't meet their criteria, and their criteria is arbitrary. So they're protecting the farmers within the cooperative from competition from the farmers outside the cooperative. So it's still unjust.
Is that what Dan, I have a question.
Sure.
You mentioned at some point that the standard approach to busting monopolies is basically using antitrust. So I wanted to ask you, do you know of any approach that is better, not in relation to the past, but also today? What is the most effective way of dealing with it?
Well, today the network monopolies are trickier. You know, the Facebooks and stuff. I think the best you can do is you can have common carrier laws. So that doesn't get rid of the monopoly profit, but it does get rid of the arbitrary manipulation of the media and of the voters. You know, they didn't rig the election; they fortified it. Who was it? I think it was Zuckerberg went in and started campaigning for mail-in voting, and reforming the election laws, and he was calling that fortifying the election, but it was manipulating the election. But you couldn't speak out. I mean, you get banned from YouTube and Facebook. If you talked about Hunter Biden's laptop, you got put in Facebook jail, and your YouTube videos got taken down. And it turns out it wasn't false information after all, but prior to the election, it was false information. The Wuhan lab theory was false information. And so many things that have since been accepted as true that went against the narrative of those in control are now were censored as false information. And there's a section 230 of the internet code protects them from lawsuit if something gets put on their platform that is bad, provided that they expeditiously take it down. So, but the criteria for that should be that it's something that's illegal. I mean, child pornography is the most illegal thing. Pornography in general, you could say, violates an objective standard. But to say that we're going to arbitrarily take down things we disagree with, you should not be protected from lawsuits against you for refusing to show something that was legitimate. So that would be one thing. I don't think government could own Facebook or Google or I just don't think that government could manage that. Now, government could own the trunk lines, which are, the trunk lines are basically the main high volume transmission lines. They're owned by Verizon and Sprint and UUNet, and the one was, I'm trying to remember there's like 4 major owners of internet trunk lines, and it's almost all communication goes through those 4 trunk lines, and they charge something of a monopoly price for those. But that's just maintaining the lines. That's like government owning the telegraph. That could be done. But I don't know that government could own those other things and manage them intelligently. It's possible that it could own the skeleton of it and make everything open to independent. Everybody's search engine could, they could require that Google not give preference to people on searches. But that's tricky because it does it by complicated algorithms that I'm not sure government could even understand. But yeah, I mean, one thing that's clear is that right now the Biden administration is telling the various media platforms to shut down various things it considers to be fake news. Well, that's violating the First Amendment by proxy. As soon as there's collusion between the government and these media monopolies, it's no longer a private enterprise acting privately. It's a private enterprise at the behest of government. Joe, you're muted.
Great presentation. I have nothing to add to what you said. I don't know a fraction of this material. It was fascinating stuff. Thanks so much. I would like to add something about the commentary that was going on as we, when I logged in, they were talking about the contribution or the reverse of England. And I'm reminded of an old history professor who said to us that there isn't kind of a corner of the world that doesn't have something to apologize for. So we all have a lot to be humble about. Your comment about the
Antarctica
Yeah, maybe.
Antarctica can make no apologies.
Yeah, no, penguins are fine. Your comment about the government, this privatization sort of these resources. I think that's kind of the heart of the CBDC debate right now, the central bank digital currency, where the government could, or the Federal Reserve or the Treasury would have these digital coins, but the payment system, the pipeline, could be privatized. And so you have this partnership where lots of competitors driving competition and driving the prices down of the payment system, which apparently is quite rentier, quite monopolistic, because it's the banks and the credit card companies and so forth. You really drive those costs down, which would benefit everybody and improve the quality of service. But the actual product, these central bank digital currencies, would remain in the hands of the public for the public good, public welfare. So that model, might work there.
Yeah, how I always want to separate how money is transferred is a different question from how money is created.
Yeah.
And Henry George, and somebody was mentioning before the talk, modern monetary theory, and the big weakness of modern monetary theory, which came out with all the stimulus money, was that the first thing that happened was not consumer price inflation, it was asset bubbles. And asset bubbles in the short run create price inflation in the long run. So what happened, the first asset bubble was when Trump was still president. The stimulus money came in, and what happened is a lot of people used it as down payments on mortgages. So real estate just shot way up, and commercial real estate also shot way up. And what happens when you pump government money into the system is that the banks say, well, now there's more money to pay us back with. So the banks create, overall have been creating roughly 19 times as much money as the government creates. So 5%, this is, I don't have the latest figures, and government has pumped in so much money lately that it might not be 95% anymore. But 4 or 5 years ago, 95% of the money in circulation was created out of thin air by commercial banks, which is a huge travesty because all the interest you're paying to the commercial banks is on money they created out of thin air. And if I was a counterfeiter and spent the money, then I would go to jail. But if I was a counterfeiter and loaned the money to people and collected interest on it, and I had a license to do that, which is what a bank is, then I would become enormously wealthy on money that I had never earned. And so, Henry George was a green banker, and he said government should create the money. And somebody asked him a question, which is a question that the MMT people would answer kind of in the positive, which is, so are you saying that government can issue as much money as it needs for whatever it thinks is appropriate to do? And Henry George said, sir, I am a greenbacker, I am not a fool. This is also in savingcommunities.org/docs under Henry George, but it's really written by Stephen Zarlenga. It's called Henry George's Views on Money. And it just quotes from a whole variety of things that Henry George had written on money.
Yeah, I've read that there, and it's a great piece. I highly recommend it.
Yeah. So, yeah, the money issue is one of the things that government should do because it's fraudulent. The value of money is created by inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. Well, then who created the value that attaches to money? Well, the people who created the goods. And we're taxing the people who created the goods. We're charging them income tax and sales tax for for selling and exchanging goods that they produced, and for earning wages that were used, you're being paid as labor to produce goods. You're taxing all those people, and then you're letting banks that created no goods, you're letting them create the money you could have created yourself. So the tragedy right now is that the MMT people have given bad ideas to the Biden administration, and they are creating money without curtailing the banks. And it's going to discredit the Greenbacker Georgist idea altogether, that the right way to do it is for government to create all the money, but to do it in a very responsible way and to curtail the banks at the same time. And so what the Biden administration is discrediting that idea by creating lots of money and not curtailing the banks as he did it. So.
Yeah. Just one last thing. On Monday, Professor Ronnie Phillips, who wrote the Chicago Plan book, will be doing a presentation on CBDCs for Alliance for Just Money Coffee House. Everybody's invited. I'll send a link.
Cool.
Great. We'll be happy to have him here at the Henry George School too.
And the
Yeah.
Chicago
Cool.
Plan is also on my website under that same documents list.
Right.
Great.
So
We have
Marty.
Marty, you want to go ahead, but make it short, please.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to make a short observation. I really enjoyed the video, even with the fast talking. But what was shown there, plus I watched a Senate hearing on transit agencies, but the arguments that were being made by the conservative, the right wing position is always missing that essential element about land being a productive factor of production. So it's like the arguments that we hear pretty much throughout politics is it all makes perfect sense to the people who drink the Kool-Aid, but then once you understand the land angle, then essentially all their arguments go to pieces, and but not enough people are listening to this alternate thing. So I really enjoyed that piece, and it was very valuable that you played that.
Thank you. Yeah, my summation of left and right is that the left wants to socialize things that are rightly private, and the right wants to privatize things that are rightly social. And so the combination, and both of them are pandering to power brokers, hoping the power brokers will make their side ascendant. And the result is that we lose no matter who's in power. It's the pendulum drives a ratchet. And so, when the left is about to get their comeuppance, and is the right going to undo all the bad things that the left did? No, they're going to race to do bad right-wing things. And it's always been that way, that every time there's a transition, they don't undo the bad things that the other side did. They go back to doing their own bad things. And so we need a coherent classical progressive, classical liberal thing. I see Alec has his hand up, and let's be real quick because Ibrahim says we're over time.
That's right. And that is that, for about a year now, I decided not to use Democrats and Republicans, right and left, conservative and liberal, and say, what is it am I in favor of and why? And leave it at that, because all of these terms tend to be used as weapons. So I don't know if anybody else agrees with this, but I find it's very much more useful, because I can be conservative about certain things, I can be liberal for others, I can be radical for others, as long as I give justifications for the position that is being held and how to bring about the result that I claim is a good result. that should be our discussions rather than the labeling of people and position and isms.
Because the isms keep changing.
Yes.
I was a left winger because I believed in free speech. Now I'm a right winger because I believe in free speech.
Oh, yeah. So like that. So what are you in favor of and why? Even ask politicians and others and intellectuals, why are you not in favor of this? What is your objection to, et cetera, et cetera. So, and if you don't like this, how will you solve the problem otherwise? You have a responsibility not just to object to something, but also to say, what are you in favor instead? Otherwise, you're sitting on a fence and shooting ideas down with no responsibility for suggesting alternatives.
Yeah, and that plays out in what happened to Henry George. I mean, the communists and the socialists were constantly attacking him, and the anarchists were constantly attacking him. And then the establishment was calling him a communist and a socialist and an anarchist.
Yeah, and it's really in order not to do something. Yeah, and that I find.
J. Edgar Hoover called Martin Luther King a communist, and the communists called Martin Luther King an Uncle Tom.
Yeah. It's very, very bad. It's very bad. It works against everybody, it seems to me, and except for the people that want to produce turmoil rather than solve problems.
Thank you very much and good night.
Night.
Good night.
I like that salute, Dan.
Yes. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.